Okay, good evening. My name is Bob Pollack. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Science and Religion, and tonight is the final seminar in the fall semester series of CSSR seminars. Our speaker is Jan Witkowski from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and Jan is the editor of many books, textbooks on molecular biology and histories of DNA. And the book that he will be talking about, the book that he'll be talking about actually has the great title, Davenport's Dream, and I recommend it to you all. Its subheading is 21st Century Reflections on Heredity and Eugenics, and it's edited by Jan and John Inglis at the Columbia University Press. And since his title for our seminar is America for Americans, I just want to introduce him and all of you to the CSSR and why we've asked him to speak with the following story from my day. This week I had the opportunity to ask one question of three different classes, one class in law and two classes in the freshman course Frontiers of Science. And the issue on the table was the complexity, diversity, and richness of diversity of the human genome. And to make the point that we are an outbred species, I asked everyone in each class to just say their first name and where their four grandparents were from. And each class had approximately 20 people. In one class, one student had four grandparents who were from the United States. In one class, none. In one class, two students had grandparents from the United States. Otherwise, everyone's grandparents were from someplace else. That raises the question of what do we possibly mean by, could we mean by America for Americans? Here's Jan Witkowski.
Well, you'll gather from my name and maybe gather from my accent that I am also a hybrid. And I will come back to that in a little bit. When I was preparing this talk and looked at my title, I decided this really wasn't right, because it's not really the politicizing of genetics. It's really the immigration, the use of misguided science by eugenics in a political sense. And my thesis is that good science, bad science, can be used for political ends. And in terms of immigration policy in the 1920s, it wasn't that the eugenicists came along and said, we've got to keep out all the immigrants. It was rather, I think, that the politicians who already decided that the aliens needed to be kept out, co-opted the eugenicists to their cause. Now, I can't claim to have any originality in what I'm going to tell you about. I'm going to tell you stories that I hope are at least moderately accurate, and I hope you will enjoy. And I made some assumptions, which I guess is always a bad thing to do. One assumption is that you may not know too much about eugenics. So my first two stories are going to be telling you a little bit about how the eugenics movement arose both in England and in the United States. Then I'll say a little bit about immigration policy in the United States, really before the eugenicists were taken on board. And there I really want to show or indicate that immigration had long been a problem, had long been a political concern in the United States, long predating the eugenicists' involvement. And then I'll talk a little bit about how those two streams came together, the political concern about immigration and how eugenicists were used to bolster those arguments. So, origin of eugenics. Here's Francis Galton, and they're always the iconic figure. If you're talking about evolution, you always have to start with Darwin. If you're talking about eugenics, you always have to start with Francis Galton. Galton was a real polymath. He was an explorer. He led expeditions in South Africa. He was a statistician. He, of course, He turned fingerprinting into a tool that could be used by police. He didn't invent fingerprinting, but he certainly was the man who popularized it. And his book on fingerprinting has this wonderful frontispiece of his palm prints on the frontispiece. He came, of course, from a very distinguished family. He was a cousin of Darwin, so therefore related him with the Wedgwoods. And it's not, I think, unlikely that it was his illustrious family and the clan that he came from that led him to think that heredity and the way talents and traits were passed along in his family was an important thing. So this was his first book on the topic. I proposed to show in this book that man's natural abilities are derived by inheritance under exactly the same limitations as are the form and physical features of the whole organic world. So I think that's not too unreasonable. But then he goes into a sentence later into the eugenics aspect, even as early as 1869. It would be quite practicable to produce a highly gifted race of men by judicious marriages during several consecutive generations. Now, I must point out again that date, 1869. So this was some 30 years before the discovery of Mendel's laws. And so quite what Galton was thinking of as heredity at this time, whether it was a Lamarckism type of inheritance, I'm not quite sure. This is, so he was a scientist, so he went to find data. And he used his sources of data, the pedigrees, or the data that he could find that was already out there. So there's there's information about all the judges in Britain from 1660 to the time when he did this in 1868, with their families, their connections, where they went to school. Same for statesmen, same for the peerage, men of science. He presumably looked at the Royal Society membership. And you'll note down the bottom here, there are wrestlers of the North Country in Cumberland, in Cumbria, where wrestling has been a sport for many years. There are records kept of who won what wrestling competitions over the years. And so he was able there to look at a physical trait, not the mental, what you might think of as mental traits for the earlier ones, but here for oarsmen and wrestlers of the North Country, he could also look at the inheritance of physical data, physical traits. But as you'll see, it's always a problem with using retrospective data, he was looking at really rather exceptional families. So one of the families he looked at has William Harvey, to discover the circulation of the blood, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, someone Speaker of the House of Commons, the First Earl of Nottingham, Lord Chamberlain, Principal Secretary of State. These are not actually quite normal families, at least the families that I know. But again, he's setting out the methodology. He's going out, he's choosing families, he's choosing traits, he's counting, he's measuring. He was a great counter and measurer. And this I think is particularly interesting. And Galton, slight aside, Galton recognized the power of twin studies for doing inheritance. So again, as early as 1869, he saw that you could use twins to distinguish between environment and heredity, between the effects of tendencies received at birth and those that were imposed by the special circumstances of their afterlives. He coined the word eugenics in his next book. Its intention is to touch on, the book's intention is to touch on various topics more or less connected with, as we might call it, eugenic questions. And that footnote leads to, that is, with questions bearing on what is termed in Greek eugenes, namely good in stock, hereditarily endowed with noble qualities. And Galton's use of the word stock here is very significant in terms of the further development, particularly in the US, of eugenics. His follower, his intellectual successor, was Karl Pearson, who was one of the great statisticians of all time, along with R.A. Fisher. In fact, Galton didn't get very involved in eugenics. He left his fortune, which was considerable, to establish the Galton Laboratory at University College London. And this was a straightforward science, genetics laboratory. This is a classic work on color blindness by Julia Bell. And so Galton's interest went one way into science. But the Eugenics Education Society was also set up in 1907 while Galton was still alive. Its principal leader at the time was Leonard Darwin, I always get it wrong, a son of Charles Darwin. And he was the president for about 30 years. And you'll notice, and then C.P. Blacker became secretary in 1926. And Blacker, really Leonard Darwin, the Eugenics Society of Darwin was an education. It was a propaganda. It was trying to persuade well-off, well-educated people to have lots and lots of babies. Under Blacker, it actually went in the reverse direction. It became much more scientific. It became sociology enterprise, developed demographics, and got very involved with birth control. Became a major promoter of birth control. So I think it's not too far-fetched to say that while in the United States, the problem of overproduction by the lower castes was dealt with sterilization, in Britain, we chose a slightly more humanitarian way and went for birth control. And that really reflects the change in that title. You'll notice that they kept the word eugenics in the title until 1989. When I was in London, I remember going to lectures at the Eugenics Society. But by 1989, they clearly felt that eugenics was not a good thing to have in the title. And it really is completely a science institute now. Its current president is Sir Walter Bodmer, who was a great geneticist, one of the leaders of the Human Genome Project. So that was really all I'm going to say about Britain. In the United States, it goes back almost as far as Galton, 1877, when Dugdale carried out this study of the Dukes, a very large family in upstate New York. Some 700 members he found of this family. And again, he did what Galton did. He went into the family and he looked at the traits of the individual members of the family. These are the sorts of family he studied. This is the Pollack family. The Duke's study spawned a whole fashion for going out into the wilds of Virginia or upstate New York or into Mississippi, and carrying out studies of this nature on families. So this is the Pollack family. There was the Nan family. There was the tribe of Ishmael. There was the Duke Edward study. It just became a fashion to do these things. But here's the Pollack family, as you can see, not altogether highest family. And this was a typical analysis. Let's see if so the key thing about the Pollacks was that there was Martin Pollack, who's the father here, and he married two women. He married this woman here, and married a cultured woman of good family, and so on. But on this side, right, he married. I'm going to have to read it off my screen. No, I should put my spectacles on. But let's say she's feeble-minded. It's probably the most charitable thing to say. And if you look at the two sides of the family coming down here from the progeny of the cultured lady are all doing fine. And there are various things there that they're traits. But if you look down the other side, see all these Fs. These are all feeble-minded. And so if you, there's another, let me see if there's shows up even more more clearly in this, how the marriage to the nameless feeble-minded girl led to tragedy, and I guess, is that the lawful wife? Everybody is doing just fine. And of course, what was meant by feeble-minded conflated a whole group of disorder, maybe not even disorder, a whole group of asocial behaviors right through, presumably, to frank psychiatric problems. And the other point that Dugdale did, and again, this is a very strong theme, he worked out the costs to society. So here, and these are theoretical calculations, of course. You know, there were 1,200 people, there were 280 who were in the poorhouse, there were 140 criminals, been in prison for 140 years, cost of maintenance. And in the end, it came up to about $2 million that this family had cost society. And this economic justification was, of course, a very strong one, and frankly, is still a strong one in this society. Now, we'll move ahead about 30 years now to Cold Spring Harbor. This is where I work. It was originally set up as a training facility for biology teachers, and the first purpose-built lab is that little building there, Jones Laboratory. And here's an example of a class from 1890 holding a horseshoe crab. You know, at that time, in the turn of the 19th, 20th century, the place to go and do research was at the seaside, because there was the Naples station, there was Johns Hopkins had a station on the west coast. You studied evolution by looking at these little sea creatures that you could study and examine very easily. And Davenport was the first director of the lab who was a real scientist, and was a director, as you can see, for 36 years. His first big thing was to persuade the Carnegie Institute to set up a station for experimental evolution, doing the work that I've just mentioned about looking at sea organisms. And this is the Station for Experimental Evolution. This, of course, is corn, and this is George Shull's corn. So this is the first hybrid corn in the world was produced at Cold Spring Harbor. So we bear some credit for the Green Revolution. Davenport became a very enthusiastic supporter of Mendel in the United States. He wrote the first paper on Mendel that was published in the United States. And here's a quote from him in 1909. "The necessity of applying new knowledge, Mendelism, to human affairs has been too evident to permit us to overlook it." And he and his wife Gertrude did publish about 5 papers on fairly respectable papers on human genetics. Just looking at simple traits here like hair color, eye color, and skin pigment. Well, they were pretty decent work for that period. But picking up on that human aspect, this is his little book, Eugenics, in 1910. "Shall we not take the steps that scientific study dictates as necessary to dry up the springs that feed the torrent of defective and degenerate protoplasm?" It's wonderful, rolling off the tongue, it's almost Shakespearean. And that became sort of formalized under the American Breeders Association, which began in 1903. And as you see here, it says, Society of Practical Breeders, persons who are taking part in the movement to improve the human race by the application to mankind of scientifically ascertained laws of heredity. And I mentioned earlier about Galton's use of the word stock. Well, here is the first eugenics movement in the United States arising from the American Breeders Association. And they set up this section on eugenics, I think it was I haven't got my notes, about 1907. And here's their magazine from 1910. And I think it's an interesting slide, because here you have straightforward studies of genetics, of genetic breeding. Here's George Shull and his hybrid corn. Down here we have Raymond Pearl on the hatching quality of eggs, and I'll come back to Raymond Pearl. And here we have Charles Davenport giving the report of the Eugenics Committee. It was a very distinguished group of individuals. On the science side, let me see whom I can spot. Conklin, great embryologist. Castle did genetics of on mice. Cannon, the physiologist. Over here, we've got Jennings, and I'll come back to him later. He's another geneticist. Ross Harrison, the great embryologist who should have won a Nobel Prize. And down here we have Albert Johnson. He was a member of Congress, and I'll come back to him. Frank Lilly, McClung, who worked on chromosomes and Drosophila. You know, a distinguished group of people who, and I think this is something else that tends to get gets overlooked, is that eugenics was a respectable thing in those days. I mean, we look back on eugenics and think how awful it was, but it was actually part of we tend to look back, you know, with a retroscope, judging the way people felt and thought in those days with our current standards and morals, which I think is an unfortunate thing to do. Here's the annual meeting of the Eugenics Research Association in June of 1918. And there are 2 points to make about this slide. One is, I think, very striking, is the number of women who are in this group. And this is also true of the Eugenics Society in the UK. Women were a very, very large part of the eugenics movement. And the other reason for showing you this slide is number 31 is Harry Laughlin. Harry Laughlin, let me just see what my next slide is. Yes, Harry Laughlin came to Cold Spring Harbor to the Station for Experimental Evolution to do genetics, but very quickly developed an interest in eugenics. Davenport persuaded Mrs. Harriman, who was the widow of a very wealthy tycoon, to give money to establish the Eugenics Records Office at Cold Spring Harbor. And Laughlin became the superintendent, the day-to-day director of the Eugenics Records Office. Overall, Mrs. Harriman gave something like $1 million to the Eugenics Record Office in the period that she was alive. So there's Laughlin, who was in that previous picture as the superintendent. One of the main things was to go out and collect data for eugenic studies. And here's a class at Cold Spring Harbor. Here's Davenport teaching it. Again, you can see a preponderance of women. These were students who'd come from Barnard or from Radcliffe or whatever for the summer and be trained and work. And here's Laughlin's lecture notes that start off with laws with the cell, laws of hereditary Mendel, go through anthropology, a lot of anthropology, and rather dubiously or ominously end with electron sterilization. This is the sort of record questionnaire they went out with, and these young women would go and knock on doors and then start asking the occupants all these very private questions about them, their history, their physical characteristics, their mental characteristics, their temperament, their personal appearance, and so on. And then they'd draw up these little pedigrees. And again, you know, things like brain fever, died in infancy, miscarriage, alcoholism, wanderlust. Isn't that so along with you know, what we would regard as quite sensible questions to ask about things like occurrence of eczema and asthma and allergies, longevity, you then get civic and religious leadership is carried on as a trait, sort of given equal weight with what we regard as conventional things. And I think, yeah, that's about it. Anyway, so there were a lot of these. Oh, so staying with the traits a moment, here are two rather silly ones. This is from International Congress on Eugenics. So it was presumably felt that people of culture would inherently know better about the fine texture of a sable compared with a fleece. And here, of course, is the classic one. Davenport published a book this thick on the inheritance of boat building, of a love of the sea. So he analysed boat builders, and he analysed the families of admirals, of sea captains, and was astounded to find this inheritance of interest in the sea was X-linked. It ran through the males. Well, I said there were a lot of them. There were about 150,000 of these cards in these filing cabinets. As far as one could tell, absolutely nothing was done with them. They did try to promote, the Eugenics Society did try to promote better health through these eugenics health exhibits that were held at state fairs. And you'll see here, I think, I can't quite make them out, but they're concerned about illiteracy, birth rate, and they held these fitter family competitions. And here's a fitter family, and you can see the young girl over here is holding down the boy here. They're fitter family winning cups. And these contrasted somewhat with, again, clearly an unfit family. A long settled valley where much consanguineous marriage has taken place. So I'm going to move away from there for the moment, from the eugenics, and talk a little bit about immigration. So here are a Slovenian gypsy family at Ellis Island, and it was precisely this sort of people that the American population worried about. Because when those people got to the big cities, they simply lived in tenements like this, under very poor conditions of hygiene and so on. And the interest in immigration certainly goes back, well, obviously long predates 1882, but the first immigration law was passed then. And all I really want this slide to do is to show you that over this period of 25 years, there was considerable interest, or was it 26, 25, 35 years, there was considerable interest over this whole period in controlling immigration into the United States. Interestingly, you can see that it wasn't terribly successful once it got up to the presidents. Vetoed by Cleveland, vetoed by Taft, vetoed by Woodrow Wilson. And this was primarily to do with this literary test. But by 1917, it did pass Congress. And this graph illustrates what concerned people. So here's the rate of immigration into the United States over this period from 1820 to 1900. And so clearly, when you're up at this sort of level, people start to get worried. And I'll point it out here, and I'll show you again in a moment. It wasn't just the numbers that were of consequence. It was where they came from. So up until this period, in this period, most of the immigrants came from essentially Northern Europe. And after this, in this period, they came from less desirable areas of the world. And this is shown here in a table form, so that if you look at Northern Europe, very large number of people coming in 1850, it's gone up threefold. But if you look at Eastern Europe, which of course starts at a very low level, it actually rises 2,000-fold in this period, even though, of course, the absolute numbers are the same. But it was these sorts of increase that concerned people. And it concerned them because they associated stereotypes with these people. It wasn't particularly races. It was actually perhaps from Jewish. It was to do with where you came from. So clearly, if you're this is good. If you're highest for leadership, you're doing good. If you're highest for suspiciousness, that's not so good. If you're highest for obtrusiveness, I'm not quite sure what it is, that's not so good. But basically, when you look at a table like this, you can quite clearly see it's good if you come from Germany, and it's bad if you come from Italy. It's just, And the other thing I think to point out is what Davenport based this on. You know, a sample of 102 high school children. So this is a more graphic representation of that sort of view. So this is really, I suppose, one might call it licentiousness. And you'll notice that the Nordics are way over here, very cool, and whereas this group are less well behaved. This is a truly remarkable book. I'll show you a couple of more pictures from the book, but it is a remarkable book. But basically, it's the association between race, origin that was the issue. So bringing these two together. It was this Congressman Albert Johnson who was the prime worker on immigration. As you can see here, he was chairman of the Immigration and Naturalization Committee. And it was he who got in touch with Laughlin. And Harry Laughlin wrote a series of big reports for this committee. And here's a list of the hearings that he took part in. So beginning in 1920, so he took part in 6 in a period of 9 years, and was doing this sort of research. So here are the hearings, and these are substantial pieces of work. I mean, they're 200-300 pages, full of tables. I mean, he gave his lifeblood to do this work. If only he'd devoted it to more useful things. But anyway, so he was the scientific advisor to this committee. And these are the sorts of data that he produced. So this is intelligence. And you'll notice that England, my English accent, we do very well. We're way up here. But again, if you look at the spread down here, you're in that group of countries, that group of origins in East Europe or Mediterranean. Those are the 2 big areas. They tended to overlook things like Negro officers were 3rd. So if you're arguing that racial characteristics define a group, it's not quite clear why you would find Negro officers way up here. At the other end, of course, you find the Negroes from the South at the very bottom of the scale. All types of social inadequacy. All right. So again, Switzerland, native white, but American Negro way up the top here. They must have looked at this data with a very selective filter. But we're okay. You know, Turkey, Ireland, Bulgaria, Greece, they're all down here still, so that's fine. In fact, I suppose one could argue that they were actually much more worried about this. They were worried about this area than they were worried about what was up here. Interestingly, under Johnson's authority, Laughlin became, I can't remember the phrase, so like a special investigator for the committee. And again, they loved these big questionnaires. Drew up a big questionnaire that was sent to all the prisons and poorhouses. Again, and in this case, they were trying to find out the degree to which newly arrived aliens were disproportionately represented in jail. This again is this sort of data. So this is particularly crime. Switzerland. Now Ireland is up here, you see. So what do you do this? Ireland, the Irish are not very bad. I'm reading this the right way around, aren't I? Yeah, the Irish aren't very bad at being criminals, but they're very bad at chasing after women. So how do you balance these things? Here's another one from Hooton's book. So I have to point out, in interests of whatever, Polish. So here's half of me climbing being the worst for burglary and larceny. On the other hand, the British are down here, so I presumably work out somewhere around Near Eastern. And I have to show you the enlargement of the bottom bit, because here we have the Italian. Here you have the Italian with his stiletto, and the Brit with his umbrella. Yeah, just wonderful, sort of iconic associations of objects. Okay, so here we have another one. So this is so what he's doing here, he's comparing British people, offspring of immigrants, British immigrants to the United States, with the home country, and similarly for the Irish and Germans. And this sort of chart was used to argue that what you were getting from Britain or what you were getting from Ireland were not the best people. If you were getting the best people, you wouldn't see this difference. What you were getting the dregs of society from Britain and the dregs of society from Ireland, which is why once they got here and started reproducing, they contributed so disproportionately to the burden. And here's Laughlin's thing again, the deterioration of the American stock. Let's just read the bottom. Well, you can read it, I'll just read the bottom. We want to prevent any deterioration of the American people due to immigration of the inferior human stock. And this comes from his first report and here's where my title comes from, America for the Americans. I should have said I'm actually distorting the chronology a little bit here. I'm sort of, if there's a point I want to make in 1925, I'm not hesitating to take something from 1935. So I'm being a bit anachronistic in my chronology. And this is what they want to do. They introduced a quota system. So they're going to set the level of immigration of people from a particular region to a percentage of the people from that region who were living in the USA at the time of a particular census. So it's better to... So the first one was 1921, set a total immigration of 358,000. And it said you could only take 3% of the number of residents, let's say Britain. So you could only, of all the Britons living in the United States in 1910, say there were 300. You could only take, the number you would allow in 1921 was 3% of 300. Right? So it was the proportion you took in 1921 was the same proportion as were there in 1910. Now, 3 years later, Johnson decided that wasn't stringent enough. So what he now did in 24, this Johnson Act, he dropped the percentage to 2%, but much more significantly, he changed the census to 1890. And let me show you what that does. So this was the first act. So in England, in 1910, there were nearly 900,000. At 3%, you could take in 26,000 in 1921. And similarly down here. Right? There were that many from the Soviet Union, so 3% is that. So that was the number that you would take in 1921. Now, when you change the census and change the percentage, this is what happened. The number of people from England, Germany, Sweden, were all pretty much the same between 1890 and 1910. There's a huge difference in Italy, Poland, the Soviet Union, and Mexico. And when you work out the percentage, so these are the numbers that you could get under the first bill, these are the numbers you could get under the second bill. And you can see the effect. So you've dropped from having 28,000 from Poland down to 2,900. Whereas here, the numbers, 26,000, 20, in fact, let me show you those percentages. So the change from here to here is 31%, 20%, 47% for the areas where you're quite happy to have people. But when you get down to these bad areas, this change means you've altered it by 90%. You drop the numbers you're allowing in by 90%. Okay. And so as a consequence of that, the immigration from Eastern Europe fell tremendously. And here's the impact of that legislation. I mean, here it obviously gets confounded by the war, but essentially it falls away a lot. This spike here is the Immigration Reform and something Act, which enabled a great many illegal immigrants to get citizenship. Anyway, the geneticists, I think, who had tolerated the eugenicists' use of genetics, now began to get really worried, because it was clear that Laughlin and the eugenicists were having an effect on policy, having an effect on society. And so, rather belatedly, one might say, they began to criticize the eugenicists. And you saw Raymond Pearl earlier had that paper in the American Breeders Association. But here's his critique in 1928. A mingled mess of ill-grounded and uncritical sociology, economics, anthropology, and politics, full of emotional appeals to class and race prejudices, solemnly put forward as science, and unfortunately accepted as such by the general public. And then T.H. Morgan, the first Nobel laureate in genetics. The interesting thing with this quote from Morgan is this last bit here, where he talks more enlightenment on the social causes of deficiencies, rather than more elimination in the present deplorable state of arrogance as to the causes of mental differences. So again, he is now emphasizing social environmental effects. So really I think by the 30s, early 30s, certainly in the United States and in the UK, eugenics was fading rather fast. And of course, it is really the further use of eugenics arguments in Germany in the war that really put the nail in any pretense that eugenics could have to being a force in our countries. And in particular, it was this, and of course in the eugenical news, this sentence here, was it this sentence? Yes. The text of the German statute reads almost like the American model sterilization law, which was one that Harry Laughlin did. So 10 years later, to say that American not legislation, because it wasn't legislation, American ideas were the foundation for Holocaust. American eugenical ideas were the foundation for the Holocaust. Really did put the knife into eugenics, and for a good while afterwards into any studies of human genetics at all. So my general thesis has been about the essentially use by politicians of scientific arguments, and the way in which some scientists are very happy to go along because they like the publicity, they like the spotlight on them. But I just put this in to show that this is not this interface of science and politics is by no means an old one. This is from a few years ago, when Liz Blackburn was essentially thrown off the ethics panel that President Bush had set up. And this article here is a great one for discussing this relationship between science and politics, and the degrees to which, over issues like global warming, for example, political ends trump science and trump, not even science, they trump data, they trump facts. And while I think politicians have a responsibility to make decisions, I really would like them to be made more on facts rather than just on dogma. Most of these images, and you'll find a lot more of them, come from our website at Cold Spring Harbor. And I urge you to go there and if you're interested in exploring this anymore. Thank you.
Questions? Questions? Comments? Arguments? No questions? Always. Wait, there's a microphone coming.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, my name is Elena. I have a question about modern eugenics. Does it still exist? And if yes, who are the members of it and what they're doing?
I don't know about the United States. The Eugenics Society still exists in the UK, say now called the Galton Institute. But I think really eugenics through the 1950s and 1960s really moved into medical schools. It became a medical thing. So beginning, I suppose, with the discovery of chromosomal abnormalities in the mid-50s. There was ever since then, human clinical genetics has assumed, sort of taken over the mantle of what the eugenicists were trying to achieve. The difference, I think, the argument is that the eugenicists in the 20s and 30s, or even earlier, were imposing on individuals. They were saying women in these institutes have got to be sterilized. The men in these institutes are going to have vasectomies. And there was no court of appeal. There was all these procedures were carried out with no informed consent at all. And I suppose in a sense, modern eugenics now says, well, we're not going to tell you we're not going to tell you that you shouldn't have children. We will tell you that you may be carrying the Huntington's disease gene, and you have a 1 in 2 chance that your children may have Huntington's disease. If you choose to go ahead and have a child, that's entirely up to you. We could do prenatal diagnosis if you want, but if not, go ahead. Now, of course, it's not as rosy as that. I mean, there are huge penalties associated with having children who have hereditary disorders. You know, the economic costs are there. So it's not. So even though I say this is, there are no pressures on the individual to make a choice. It's sort of an autonomous choice. I mean, that really isn't the case. In a perfect world, if there was support for everybody, that could be the case. But it really isn't.
Hi. Do you see any similarity in the modern situation where you can sometimes select for certain qualities in your own child by selecting sperm donors or egg donors with particular qualities? Is this a sort of positive eugenics, or do you not see any similarities?
It depends what traits you're thinking of.
A donor who's gone to an Ivy League school. Intelligence, I guess, would be the trait.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the great problem, great fallacy of Davenport and Laughlin and the eugenicists was that traits like intelligence were carried by single chromosomes. There was a gene for intelligence. You actually still see this. I have a wonderful slide of when Jeff Friedman cloned the leptin gene. The front of Newsday had this big thing, the gene for obesity. You know, there's no the gene for any of these complex traits. And so simply putting a sperm from Harvard and an egg from Radcliffe is not going to produce the next president of the United States. These traits are just too complicated. And although I'm a firm believer that everything about us has a genetic component, there are certain things. Well, you know, if I have a mutation in my dystrophin gene, I will have Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but at varying degrees, even with a mutation with dystrophin. But at the other end of the scale, with things like intelligence, the role of the environment, you could probably have the best genes possible, and if you don't get a good education, then that potential is not to be realized.
I wanted to pick up on the slide that showed that 3 successive presidents vetoed a congressional law to introduce a literacy requirement. There are 10 to 20 million people in the United States today, some of who are here legally, some of who are here illegally, most of whom are Spanish speaking. And there is a very strong political movement in the United States to exclude them on the grounds that they're not English speaking. Now, it would be a very big reach even for these idiotic cartoons to make speaking English or speaking Spanish a genetic difference, but the way people are treated is as if that were a genetic difference. Rather than considering the cost and necessity of teaching English to people here, the fact that they don't speak English is once again being used, as in the literacy, as a filter of exclusion for whatever the political reasons. So I wonder if you would speak about how you see today's re-emergence, or do you see today, or what form today does the impulse that led to the calling for a law demanding literacy, which on the face of it sounds reasonable, but would have kept my ancestors in Poland and Ukraine long enough for the Nazis to have killed them. Do you see that impulse to keep them out of our country, though we're all immigrants, expressing itself today, and to what extent are we producing data in molecular biology that serves the purposes of such people?
Well, I don't think this issue about foreigners in your own country has probably been with us forever. It may have been from the next village in our village, but you only have to look at the European community to see the tremendous turmoil in the European community about migrations of Polish workers into Poland. Polish workers into England. So I think this is, I'm tempted to say this is an inherited trait, that human beings are naturally, no, but naturally keep together. The Columbia football team supporters don't go and cheer for Harvard. I mean, we tend to be tribal. Now, maybe.
No, that's a theoretical construct.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know about molecular biology contributing to that. Did you mean sort of like the obesity thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any questions, please?
Yeah. I think it's just amazing.
Wait from. All right, talk loud.
I think it's amazing to me how much bigotry and discrimination there was, certainly in the early immigration. But if you look at life today with genetic engineering and higher education, I think that so many people, let's say of average intelligence or positions in society, are really feeling left in the dust because they're not validated enough. There's not enough growth. There's not enough potential, let's say, to maintain, just an average middle-class life. So I'm looking at the world. I mean, I certainly believe in education and advancement. But I mean, with all that's going on today, genetic engineering and, high education, it just seems that the solution is a bigger problem than where it started, because there's so many social issues, and if you look at the world in general, I think it's, there's a higher purpose that really has to govern where we go from here, and it's not just getting, a PhD in this and this and this. What about basic social problems that this is, just riding over? Do you understand me?
I do. I have no comment at all. But except saying that I think at any moment in society, we think our problems are either much better or often much worse than at any other time, and at any other time people thought that their problems were very much worse. It's terribly difficult to change culture, to change sociology, and it takes years and years to do so.
I think also that society, like a genetic pool of people are so driven by two things: their culture, and much of that in most people is unconscious. Your emotional makeup, which we fail to.
Let's have a question. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you.
So those eugenicists were wrong. They were wrong both about attributing complex traits like intelligence to single genetic transmittable genes, right?
Mm-hmm.
One single trait. And they were wrong about thinking of national groups as one genetic pool, as one thing. What if they had been right? Which is another way of asking, what if our more nuanced and more scientifically sound understanding yields knowledge of this type, that is, yields that certain particular genetic configurations or combination of genes make one susceptible, well, we already know that can make one susceptible to diseases. There can be other complex things that we now learn through good science that allow us to distinguish people. Does your study tell us anything about how we might think about policy and social questions that the new, better science throws up?
I'm not sure, frankly, that it does. I mean, I think even if the eugenicists were right in their science, then their behavior was not morally justified. And I think that applies now, that really, and it's sort of what I said at the end about the politicians having the final word, or society having the final word. How we act upon this information. This sounds awful. Yeah. Okay, it's not the scientist's responsibility. Of course, that isn't really true. But I think in terms of how the government could make a decision to stop doing research on genetic disorders, which account for a minute proportion of healthcare. Well, actually, that's not. They actually account for a disproportionate. It's still very small, and they might say, well, let's ignore all these people. Let's ignore the 5,000 families with Duchenne muscular dystrophy in the United States, and let's use that money for something else. Now, I think we would say that was a morally reprehensible thing to do. I think there should be universal health care. And I'm speaking as someone who pays taxes but isn't allowed to vote. So I'm not sure that, I don't understand the linkage or how to use scientific information to inform policy that is morally and socially correct. I'm garbling a bit, I'm afraid.
I think that Jan has just exemplified his point. One way is to speak as you speak, here and in other places, and take responsibility for transmitting these facts to voters, and citizens as citizens, being one yourself. I don't see any other answer but to serve the society with science as necessary but not sufficient service. I think that's it. And with that, have we got another question? Yes, we do. Excellent. I knew that would bring up a question.
I'm not sure this is something you can answer, but I'm curious about it. When I was growing up, they talked about different races, like there were specific races. And I'm understanding now that this is questioned, so I'm really curious. I'm not sure if that's quite my question, but I think it is.
Well, I think it again comes down to this, not necessarily a clash, but this contrast between a scientific analysis and social, cultural determinations. The view at the moment, I think, in genetics is that there are changing, so genes can exist in different forms. So the gene for hemoglobin can exist in, let's say, 10 different forms without causing disease. These differences, different forms of the gene are called alleles. And you can look across populations and you can find populations in which, say, allele A predominates, and another population is allele B, and in another population it's allele C. And so you might say on that basis you've got three races, A, B, and C. But then when you look at other genes, the alleles of other genes, you find everything gets sort of mixed up. And you can recognize, if you look globally, you can find changes in frequencies of different alleles of genes that flow over the whole globe. So there aren't any. There's no. If you take Italy and look at the alleles of individuals in Italy, they show such huge overlap with those in France that you can't distinguish them really in anything other than a sort of statistical nature. And when you take any one single individual, then it's up for grabs. So I think the idea of there being genetically defined races has been replaced by this sort of smearing out over the whole globe. But that doesn't make race any less of a fact culturally and socially. I wish it did.
Yes, I was thinking of it on the biological level. That's what I was
Right. It's perpetuated to some degree because cultural and racial characteristics can be used as surrogates for the underlying genetics. So if you have someone from, it's a bit of an exaggeration, someone from Northern Europe who's having problems breathing, well, cystic fibrosis has a much higher level in Northern Europe than elsewhere. If you have somebody coming to you with sickle cell anemia, the chances are it's going to be an African American rather than someone of Caucasian descent. So you can, in medical terms, there's a great controversy about this, the degree to which you can use characteristics of people, racial cultural characteristics of people, to help guide you to a diagnosis that's more likely for that individual. But it's very, of course, it doesn't work all the time. So.
One more question back.
There's been a lot of talk in the news lately about personalized medicine coming up. And do you expect there to be more discussion about eugenic issues as personal genetics and personal medicine develops?
Well, I think in theory it should do away with eugenics in the sense of being a social movement. When the day comes when we can all have our own genome sitting on a DVD, you go to the doctor's office and you plop it in, and she says, "Oh, you've got the sniffles today. Well, that's because you've got the A allele of the influenza receptor. Now I know what to give you." At that stage, you're now because you're now dealing with individuals and not race and cultural race are definitions of groups. Once you get down to the individual, in a sense, all that disappears. So I'm overly optimistic that when we can get down to real personal medicine, which is when you have your genome and we can interpret it, which is the real difficult thing. A physician will be able to make decisions that relate specifically to you, irrespective of your racial or cultural background. You'll still want to know whether you smoke, how much you drink, and what you've been exposed to. You'll still want to know. She still want to know about your environment. But of course, environment is just about the most personal thing you can have too. So I'm hopeful it might help.
I want to restate what Jan said this way. It seems to me that medicine, by definition, is to care for one person at a time, however complex the structure of delivering medical care. So the absence of medicine for 50 million people is the absence of 50 million individuals failing to get the help that this genetic information might provide. Any time one is dealing with genetic information to help a person in their life, then by definition, it's the opposite of a eugenic agenda, which is driven by the notion of improvement of some badly defined and biologically non-existent notion of us at the cost of the individual. So practice at the cost of an individual is anti-medical, and medical uses are anti-eugenical, I think, intrinsically. That said, I want to thank everybody and thank Jan for a great presentation.
Thank you, Bob.